About some more aspects of solutions. Specifically, we're going to focus in here on solvents, the solvent part of the solution. And we're going to take a look at one of the more common solvents we're going to encounter, which is water. Okay, so water is it's a very common solvent, and so much so that it's actually sometimes considered the universal solvent because it tends to dissolve most solutes, but not all of them, but the majority of them. And we'll see here that there's a simple rule that we can use to help us predict what will or will not dissolve in water or in any solvent for that matter. So there's some properties of water that we looked at before in a couple of the earlier chapters. So for instance, we know that water is, what's the shape of water? The water molecule. It's bent. And water, as in terms of its polarity, is water polar or non-polar? Polar. It's polar, right? It's very polar. And that actually allows it to interact with certain substances, but not others. We also saw, when we looked at these intermolecular forces of attraction and polarities of molecules, we said that due to the fact that water, you can't see that really well, but if you have a water molecule like this, made up of two H's and an O, because of the bent shape, but more importantly, because of the atoms involved, we know that this water molecule can hydrogen bond with another one, right? Because you have the H present and covalently linked to an oxygen, which is extremely electronegative. So we have these hydrogen bonds holding the water molecules all together. So the polar nature of water impacts what it can and cannot dissolve. And we can come up with a simple rule that helps us decide whether solutions will form in the first place. All right, and the rule goes like this. It's really, really simple, but how we interpret it is the more important thing. So it says, like dissolves like. And all that means is that a solution will form if the solute and the solvent have similar polarities. In other words, in order for the solution to form, if the solvent is polar, the solute has to be polar. So they have to have like polarities. Similarly, if the solvent is non-polar, the solute, in order to dissolve in it, would also have to be non-polar. So if the polarities are different between the solute and the solvent, the solution is not going to form, right? They're not going to mix evenly or uniformly. And just based on mixing two things together, you can actually predict the polarity of a molecule or a compound, right? So for example, right, if you take some water, and we know now water is polar, and we add some oil to it, stir it up to mix it, what do you see? Do they mix? No. They don't mix, right? So we know that based on all the chemistry we did so far that water is polar. So if water is polar, if the solution does not form, what does that tell you about the polarity of the oil? Is the oil polar or non-polar? It's going to be non-polar. Right? You don't have to draw the structure of the oil. You can just predict its polar versus non-polar nature based on how it interacts with a polar substance like H2O. It may not seem like a big deal, right? But it actually is. So for example, if you have some water and you added some, maybe instead of oil, you added some alcohol to it. You stir it up to mix it. Will it mix? those of you that have experience in this field. Some of us have more experience than others. So I'll tell you, if you haven't done that before, yes, they mix very well, right? So because the water is polar and the alcohol mixes with it, we can then say that the alcohol, so they mix well. We can then say that the alcohol is polar. All right, and again, it's something very simple, but it actually drives lots of biological and biochemical processes and structures. So for instance, around each of your cell, there is a barrier called a cell membrane, right? And the way that barrier actually forms and the types of molecules that make up that cell membrane, their orientation in that membrane is driven by this thing, by like dissolving like. Right? You wouldn't be able to have that cell membrane without the molecules that make up that membrane that have both polar and non-polar characteristics in them. Hang on to that. We're going to come back to that when we get to our biochemistry after spring break. It's a big deal in not just in chemistry, but in biology. All right, so we've talked about why solutions form in the first place. If the polarities are the same, solutions will form. In some solutions, we're going to encounter solutions that contain solutes that are ionic compounds or ionic solutes. So how do these solutions actually form in the first place? So your ionic compounds, when they do dissolve, they're going to dissolve as ions. So the ionic compound, in other words, it is going to dissociate, which is just a fancy word for break apart, into its component ions. So for example, right, you've seen this multiple times in your kitchen or anywhere else. You take some salt and you add it to water and you stir it up, and what do you see happen to the salt? The crystals. What happened? Can you still see them after you mix it up? No, it looks like they disappear, right? But do they really disappear? Do they vanish? No, they dissolve, and the way that they dissolve is the solid, that big crystal, or even a small crystal, the sodium chloride, breaks apart into its component ions, the sodium ion and the chloride ion. And those ions are so tiny you can't see them with your eyes. Right? So it looks like it disappears. It doesn't really. So these ions, when they separate, right, they're kept apart from each other because of the solvent. Right? The water comes in and it actually surrounds each of these ions, the sodium ion and the chloride ion, and it keeps them separated. It prevents them from coming back together and clumping together to make the crystal again. So these ions then, we say that they become surrounded by water molecules. And when something becomes surrounded by water, we say that it is hydrated. All right, and I'm just going to zoom in here really quick. So there's our crystal of sodium chloride, sodium and chloride and sodium repeating throughout. We add it to water. The water comes in and it sort of interjects itself in between those ions. And it keeps them separated, right? So you have here, this sodium ion is depicted, right, surrounded by these water molecules. The red spheres are the oxygens, and the white ones are the H's, right? Do the orientation of those water molecules around the sodium make sense? Why are the red oxygens close to the sodium rather than the
negative charge?
Remember, the oxygen is slightly negative, right, because of its high electronegativity. So it would make sense that the negative part of the water is close to the positive ion. And similarly, the positive ends of the water molecule, the H's, are close to the negative chloride ion. So that's how this hydration happens that allows the sodium chloride to dissolve in the first place as it breaks apart or dissociates into ions. So whenever an ionic compound dissolves in water, this is the mechanism by which it is going to do that. It splits into its component ions that become surrounded by water molecules. So the ability of a substance to form ions then leads into its nature as either an electrolyte or a non-electrolyte. So we're going to talk a little bit about these different types of electrolytes. The first thing we need to do is to define what an electrolyte is. Has anybody heard the term electrolyte before? In what setting or where have you heard the term electrolyte?
Sports.
Sports?
You need to replace your electrolytes because you're sweating so much.
So you replace your electrolytes how?
Drinking like Gatorade or something.
Gatorade or Powerade, if that's your thing. But something that contains these quote-unquote electrolytes in it. Yeah.
I'm in surgery when they give bags of fluid.
Yeah, so what are those bags of, what are in the fluid bags?
Chloride or
Something salty?
sugar or water, sometimes,
Yeah, or if you're, you went through a bout of sickness or something and you had to be rehydrated in the hospital or elsewhere, they stuff you full of these electrolytes. So an electrolyte we can define as a substance when dissolved in water, we're going to choose water as our solvent, is able to conduct an electric current. Right, that's where the term electro and light actually stem or come from. So what then about that substance and the solution that it forms actually allows it to conduct an electric current? Well, you have to have charged species present. So what that means is an electrolyte, when dissolved in water, produces ions. So positive ions or cations and negative ions, anions. So a strong electrolyte would be a substance that produces lots of ions in solution. And in order to do that, this would suggest that it dissociates, okay, again, just a fancy word for breaks apart, completely. And the example that we've used a couple times already would be sodium chloride, right? So you add that to some water and it just breaks apart into its component ions. So all you have in that salt water solution is sodium ions and chloride ions floating around in a bunch of water. So you have tons of those ions present, which will allow it to conduct that electric current. We can test it. We can put a couple of electrodes in here with a bulb. And then if there are ions present, we can complete that circuit and cause our bulb to glow very brightly in this case. So that's a strong electrolyte. Not all electrolytes are strong though. We actually see lots of weak electrolytes. So a weak one is one in which there aren't as many ions in solution. And what this suggests is that the electrolyte does not dissociate completely. It dissociates or breaks apart a little bit to give you just a little bit of those ions in solution. And this is where we're going to encounter now a funny looking arrow. I'm going to see this funny looking arrow in the next chapter. So here HF in solution in water is going to break apart to give us the H plus and the F minus ion. But what also happens in this case is the H plus and the F minus actually recombine with each other to make back the HF. And we see an arrow going in the other direction. Right, so whenever you see that double-headed arrow going, or two arrows going in opposite directions, that's an indication that that reaction does not just proceed left to right, it actually goes in the other direction. So when we had first introduced chemical equations and a couple chapters ago, right, we said that there's always this arrow that goes from left to right. Now we're saying, well, hang on a second, there's also situations where we have the reaction going in the opposite direction. Okay? And that is a theme in chemistry, right? Especially when you're starting, you know, we can't peel back all of the layers of the chemistry onion and expose you to all of that, the inside of the onion, because, you know, like most onions, sometimes it can make you cry a little bit. So as we get deeper and deeper, we just gently pull back one layer at a time. So we didn't, you know, toss out the double-headed arrow at you at the beginning. We're just showing you that this happens. This actually happens quite frequently, where you have a left to right reaction happening, but you also have the right to left, the opposite or the reverse reaction happening as well. The point of this is, in solution, this HF does not break apart completely. It just breaks apart a fraction of the time to give you small amounts of the H plus and F minus, those ions. Because there are fewer ions present, if we were to test it here with our little device, we'll see that the bulb glows, but not very brightly. So we see a dim light. Question?
So is that saying that dissociation is the arrow going to the right and then recombination is the arrow going back to
Correct.
the left?
That's exactly what that's saying. Yeah. So the right to left is just the opposite of dissociation. And that's happening as well in this case.
Do you have like an example of the recombination? Like what's like, I'm just kind of confused on like what that would look like in like a real life scenario. Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
So what's the recombination here is just these two things recombining to make the HF.
Because they didn't dissociate completely?
So there, a portion of it is decomposed or dissociating.
Yeah.
Not all of it is. And even that small portion that's dissociating, some of that also reassociates or recombines.
Okay.
Right? So the best, actually a better way to represent this would be to have a small arrow going that way, not a big one. And I know this looks really unusual. So you have like a half an arrow going that way and a bigger arrow going that way, right? Which tells you that you actually have more of the stuff on the left than you do the stuff on the right side. Right? That's a better way to represent it, but I know it, you know, it doesn't look normal or typical for right now. So just to sort of tie that up, when you see, erase this, when you see this type of arrow, that both arrows going in opposite directions, that's an indication that that reaction, whatever it is, does not go to the right all the time. Okay, it doesn't go completely to the right side. Some of it goes back to the left. All right, so those are our weak electrolytes. Our substance, whatever it is, does not break apart completely, and we get small amounts of ions in solution. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have our non-electrolytes, where no ions are present. So in this case, whatever this substance is, dissolves, because it is going to dissolve, but it doesn't dissolve as ions, it actually dissolves as individual molecules. And as a result of no ions being present, this means that it does not conduct. Electricity, right? So for instance, methanol is shown here, but you can just as easily substitute ethanol or any type of alcohol in here. And we just said at the beginning, ethanol dissolves in water. Right? You can take my word for it, or you can do an experiment at home if you want to illustrate that. So how does the ethanol or the alcohol dissolve in water? It does not break apart into ions. It actually breaks apart into individual molecules, ethanol molecules, or in this case, methanol molecules which don't have a charge on them, right? These are neutral things. These are entire molecules of something. So no charge on these. You stick this in a little setup here. Because there aren't any ions present, our bulb does not glow. Right? Because there are no ions in that solution. So there are quite a few substances that are non-electrolytes, where they dissolve as molecules, not as ions. Your table in your textbook walks you through, or gives you some other examples of substances that act as strong, weak, or non-electrolytes. I mentioned a couple of them here. And at the beginning of the subsection here, we had asked, I'd asked you think about, places where you encounter electrolytes. And yes, and all of you are probably thinking, well, you go when you work out or something and you have to replace your electrolytes. Well, you're losing a bunch of that stuff as you sweat or as you perspire, right? So in your body fluids, your blood and elsewhere, you have a bunch of these electrolytes going through or coursing through your veins. So things like sodium ions and chloride ions and potassium ions and other types of ions are important for a variety of reasons, right? You need those things to help maintain the balance of water in your bloodstream and other body fluids, but you also need those ions for other important things, like allowing your nerve impulses to go from one nerve cell to another one, right? You have to have those ions present for many of those processes to happen. What we're going to find is that typically in a human body, there is a charge balance of the electrolytes. And what that means is that the total positive ions, the total amount of positive ions should equal the total amount of negative ions. Well, the term that we use there is concentration, which we'll see in the next section. Right, so the total amount of positive charges you have in you should equal the total amount of negative charges in you. So overall, you are a net neutral person, even though you may think, or you know people that are always negative. That does not have to do with their electrolytes, right? That has to do with other characteristics. But overall, you have to maintain that balance. And when you lose your electrolytes, you have to replace them, right? So either with your Gatorade or Powerade, or in extreme instances, getting an IV, an intravenous thing. Okay, questions so far on solutions, electrolytes, how solutions form, like dissolving like? You're going to see a couple of these things in some of your biology classes, by the way, where you'll talk a little bit more about how they impact biological systems, and then you can sort of, tie in your chemistry there, because I don't think I mentioned this yet in this class, but you really can't do biology without chemistry.